Title: Why No One Wanted to Be Sent to Kingston Penitentiary. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, subscribe, and don't forget to turn on your notifications for our next real-life prison stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. The story begins. From the moment prisoners arrived at Kingston Penitentiary, the reality behind its stone walls made the title's promise clear. Located on the shore of Lake Ontario, Kingston Pen was designed to be Canada's harshest federal prison, and for more than 180 years, it earned that reputation. According to historical records, former inmates, staff, and official inquiries consistently described Kingston Pen as a place defined by isolation, rigid discipline, and physical and psychological hardship. Long before modern conversations about prison reform, Kingston Pen embodied an older philosophy of punishment, confinement, silence, and endurance. Kingston Penitentiary opened in 1835, just 4 years after Upper Canada passed its first Penitentiary Act. Public records indicate it was built to reflect British penal theories of the early 19th century, which emphasized moral reform through strict control. The prison's limestone walls, quarried locally, were meant to project permanence and authority. From the outset, Kingston Pen was intended to house the most serious offenders in the colony, separating them from society and subjecting them to an unforgiving institutional regime. The original design was heavily influenced by the Auburn system, a model that enforced strict silence and labor during the day, with solitary confinement at night. According to documented accounts, prisoners were forbidden from speaking to one another. Violations were met with punishment, including solitary confinement, reduced rations, or corporal discipline in the prison's early decades. Silence was considered a tool of reform, but in practice, it became one of the institution's defining hardships. Cells at Kingston Pen were notoriously small. Early architectural plans show that many cells measured less than 6 feet wide, with thick stone walls and minimal ventilation. Light entered through narrow slits rather than windows. According to historical inspections, winters were bitterly cold, while summers were stifling. Prisoners slept on hard bunks with thin bedding, and for much of the prison's history, sanitation was primitive. Buckets served as toilets, emptied only at designated times. Life inside Kingston Pen followed a rigid schedule. Bells dictated when inmates woke, worked, ate, and slept. According to prison logs, days began early, often before dawn. Prisoners were marched in formation, heads down, eyes forward, to workshops where they performed manual labor. The work was monotonous and physically demanding, ranging from stone cutting to shoemaking and textile production. Labor was framed as both punishment and rehabilitation, though wages, when paid at all, were minimal. Discipline at Kingston Pen was uncompromising. Historical punishment registers describe a range of sanctions for rule violations. In the 19th century, flogging was permitted and used. Later, corporal punishment was officially abolished, but other forms of discipline remained severe. Solitary confinement, known colloquially as the hole, was a central feature of control. According to former inmate testimony cited in government inquiries, time in solitary could last days or weeks, often in near total darkness. One of the most feared spaces in Kingston Pen was the segregation range. These cells were smaller and darker than general population cells. Public inquiries later documented that prisoners in segregation were often denied reading materials, social contact, and meaningful activity. Meals were basic, and human interaction was limited to guards delivering food. The psychological impact of such confinement would become a major focus of later criticism. Kingston Pen also became known for its strict enforcement culture. Guards were expected to maintain order through authority rather than negotiation. Training manuals from the mid-20th century emphasized discipline, obedience, and control. While many officers viewed their role as maintaining safety, former prisoners and later researchers noted that this environment left little room for compassion or individualized assessment. The prison's population reflected broader patterns in Canada's justice system. According to correctional records, Kingston Pen housed a disproportionate number of repeat offenders and individuals serving long sentences. Life sentences were not uncommon, and parole, particularly in the early 20th century, was rare. For many inmates, Kingston Pen was not a temporary stop but a long-term reality. Violence was an ever-present concern. While official reports sometimes downplayed its frequency, documented incidents show that assaults between inmates did occur, particularly during periods of overcrowding. Tensions were exacerbated by limited programming and prolonged confinement. According to later reviews, the architecture itself contributed to stress, with narrow ranges, poor acoustics, and constant noise. Healthcare inside Kingston Pen was limited for much of its history. Early medical records indicate that treatment focused on basic physical ailments, with little recognition of mental health. Prisoners suffering from psychological distress were often disciplined rather than treated. It was not until the mid-20th century that mental health services began to expand, and even then resources remained inadequate by modern standards. Indigenous inmates were present at Kingston Pen throughout its history, reflecting broader colonial patterns in Canadian incarceration. While detailed demographic data from early decades is incomplete, later records confirm overrepresentation. According to documented analyses, culturally appropriate services were largely absent, and systemic factors contributing to incarceration were rarely acknowledged. Public perception of Kingston Pen evolved over time. In its early years, it was promoted as a symbol of order and justice. Newspapers described it as a necessary institution for a growing colony. However, by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, criticism began to surface. Journalists, clergy, and reformers raised concerns about conditions, questioning whether such severity truly served rehabilitation. Several official investigations examined Kingston Pen over the years. According to archived government reports, inquiries repeatedly highlighted overcrowding, outdated facilities, and harsh disciplinary practices. While some reforms were implemented, change was slow. The prison's massive stone structure made modernization difficult, reinforcing reliance on traditional control methods. Escapes from Kingston Pen were rare, but attempts captured public attention. The prison's location, surrounded by water on 3 sides and high walls on the 4th, made escape extremely difficult. According to documented cases, most escape attempts failed, reinforcing the prison's reputation as inescapable. This physical isolation contributed to the sense of hopelessness reported by many inmates. Kingston Pen also became a training ground for correctional practices across Canada. Policies and routines developed there influenced other federal institutions. This meant that its punitive culture had an impact beyond its walls, shaping national correctional norms for decades. By the mid-20th century, attitudes toward incarceration began to shift. Criminologists and policymakers increasingly questioned whether institutions like Kingston Pen achieved their stated goals. According to parliamentary debates and policy papers, rehabilitation and reintegration began to gain prominence, at least in theory. Kingston Pen, however, struggled to adapt. Educational and vocational programs were limited. While some workshops provided skills, access was inconsistent. Inmates serving long sentences often saw little incentive to participate. According to former inmate interviews cited in later studies, the environment discouraged personal development, fostering resignation rather than reform. Religious services were available, reflecting historical beliefs about moral correction. Chaplains played a visible role, offering counseling and conducting services. Yet even these interactions were constrained by security protocols and the culture of silence that lingered long after formal rules changed. As decades passed, Kingston Pen became increasingly out of step with modern correctional standards. Reports from the late 20th century described crumbling infrastructure, poor ventilation, and inadequate accessibility. According to Correctional Service Canada assessments, retrofitting the prison to meet contemporary expectations would require extensive investment. The prison's reputation extended beyond Canada. International observers and researchers cited Kingston Pen as an example of an outdated penitentiary model. Its continued operation raised questions about the balance between tradition and reform in Canadian corrections. For those sent there, the fear was not abstract. It was rooted in lived experience, passed down through inmate networks and reinforced by institutional reality. According to documented testimony, Kingston Pen represented the most restrictive end of federal incarceration, a place where time felt heavier and hope more distant. By the early 2000s, momentum for closure grew. Public debate increasingly recognized that Kingston Pen symbolized an era of punishment Canada was trying to move beyond. According to official announcements, the decision to close the prison reflected both practical concerns and evolving values. Yet understanding why no one wanted to be sent to Kingston Pen requires more than acknowledging its closure. It requires examining how its design, culture, and history shaped generations of incarcerated people. The fear it inspired was not accidental. It was the product of deliberate choices about how justice should look and feel. This chapter establishes Kingston Penitentiary as a cornerstone of Canada's punitive past. Grounded in documented systems and historical record, it explains why the institution's name alone carried weight. To understand its legacy fully, it is necessary to look next at how daily life unfolded inside its walls and how resistance, unrest, and reform attempts emerged over time. Daily life, control, and resistance inside Kingston Penitentiary. Life inside Kingston Penitentiary was governed by control, repetition, and endurance. For those confined within its limestone walls, each day followed a rigid structure designed to enforce obedience and suppress individuality. According to historical records and official inquiries, daily routines were not simply administrative necessities but instruments of authority. They shaped behavior, reinforced hierarchy, and reminded inmates constantly of their lack of autonomy. Mornings at Kingston Pen began early. Bells rang before sunrise, signaling prisoners to rise. According to institutional schedules preserved in archives, inmates were expected to prepare quickly and stand ready for inspection. Silence, while no longer formally enforced by the mid-20th century, remained culturally embedded. Speaking unnecessarily could draw attention from guards, and attention often led to discipline. The expectation was compliance without commentary. Breakfast was sparse. Historical menus indicate meals were basic, designed to meet minimal nutritional requirements rather than comfort. Porridge, bread, and weak tea were common. Meals were eaten quickly and under supervision. Interaction between inmates was discouraged, and seating arrangements were often fixed. The purpose was efficiency, not socialization. After breakfast, prisoners were escorted to work assignments. Labor was central to Kingston Pen's philosophy. According to correctional reports, inmates worked in workshops producing goods for government use or prison maintenance. Tasks included carpentry, tailoring, shoemaking, laundry, and metal work. For much of the prison's history, refusal to work was considered a disciplinary offense. Workdays were long and monotonous. Prisoners labored for hours under supervision, often performing the same repetitive motions day after day. According to former inmate accounts cited in later studies, the work provided structure but little sense of purpose. Wages, when provided, were minimal and often credited toward basic necessities rather than personal savings. Movement within the prison was tightly controlled. Inmates walked in single file, eyes forward, hands at their sides. Guards issued commands that were expected to be followed immediately. According to training materials, order depended on predictability and discipline. Any deviation, even minor, could be interpreted as defiance. Cells remained central to daily life. Outside of work and meals, inmates spent significant time confined to their cells. Kingston Pen's cells were small, cold, and sparsely furnished. According to inspection reports, ventilation was poor, and artificial light was limited. For much of the prison's operation, inmates spent evenings alone, locked behind solid steel doors. Noise was a constant presence. Iron gates, clanging keys, shouted commands, and echoing footsteps filled the ranges. According to documented testimony, this environment made rest difficult. Sleep was often fragmented, interrupted by counts conducted throughout the night. Guards regularly checked cells to ensure inmates were present and compliant. Discipline was enforced through a graduated system of punishment. Minor infractions could result in loss of privileges, such as reduced recreation time or restricted access to correspondence. More serious violations led to segregation. According to punishment logs, segregation was one of the most feared consequences of misconduct. Segregation cells at Kingston Pen were harsh environments. They were smaller than regular cells and often darker. Inmates placed there were isolated for most of the day with limited human contact. Meals were delivered through slots in the door. According to former inmates, time in segregation distorted perception, making days feel endless. Psychological strain was common. Although early prison administrators rarely acknowledged mental health, later reports recognized high levels of distress among inmates. Anxiety, depression, and emotional withdrawal were frequently observed. According to medical records from the mid-20th century, some inmates exhibited signs of severe psychological deterioration, exacerbated by isolation and lack of stimulation. Healthcare services existed but were limited. A prison hospital treated injuries and illnesses, but mental health care was rudimentary. Inmates experiencing psychological crises were often managed through confinement rather than therapy. According to later reviews, this approach reflected broader societal misunderstandings of mental illness at the time. Recreation opportunities were minimal. Prison yards were enclosed by high walls, offering limited exposure to the outside world. Exercise periods were scheduled and supervised. According to institutional guidelines, recreation was intended to maintain physical health, not provide enjoyment. Equipment was sparse and activities were restricted. Contact with the outside world was tightly regulated. Letters were censored, and visits were limited in frequency and duration. According to correspondence policies, mail could be delayed or withheld if deemed inappropriate. For inmates, communication with family was a fragile lifeline, easily disrupted by institutional decisions. Tensions between inmates and staff were an enduring feature of Kingston Pen. Guards wielded significant authority and relationships were often adversarial. According to later testimony, some officers exercised discretion with professionalism, while others relied on intimidation. The imbalance of power left inmates with few avenues for complaint. Resistance took many forms. While overt defiance was risky, subtle acts of noncompliance were common. Inmates might work slowly, feign illness, or violate minor rules to assert a sense of agency. According to sociological studies, such behaviors were coping mechanisms rather than organized rebellion. Occasionally, resistance became collective. Kingston Pen experienced several disturbances over its long history. These incidents were typically responses to accumulated grievances, such as overcrowding, poor food, or harsh discipline. According to official accounts, authorities often characterized unrest as security threats rather than symptoms of systemic problems. One of the most significant disturbances occurred in the mid-20th century, when inmates protested conditions through work stoppages and refusals. The response was swift. According to documented records, additional security measures were implemented, leaders were isolated, and order was restored through force and negotiation. Escalations reinforced the prison's reputation. Media coverage portrayed Kingston Pen as volatile and dangerous, reinforcing public fear. According to contemporary reporting, these narratives often overlooked underlying causes, focusing instead on spectacle and control. Rehabilitation efforts existed but were limited. Educational programs were sporadic, and access depended on behavior and sentence length. According to correctional evaluations, inmates serving long sentences had fewer opportunities, as resources were prioritized for those nearing release. Religious services offered some solace. Chaplains provided counseling and conducted services across denominations. According to institutional records, participation was voluntary, and some inmates found comfort in these interactions. However, religious programs operated within the same restrictive framework as other activities. As decades passed, criticism of Kingston Pen intensified. Criminologists questioned whether its punitive model produced meaningful change. According to policy analyses, recidivism rates among released inmates suggested limited rehabilitative impact. Staff also faced strain. Working conditions were challenging and morale fluctuated. According to union statements and internal reviews, guards experienced stress, burnout, and safety concerns. The rigid environment affected everyone inside, not just inmates. Daily life at Kingston Pen was defined less by dramatic events than by relentless routine. Days blurred together, marked by bells, counts, and confinement. According to former inmates, this monotony was itself a form of punishment, eroding motivation and hope. By the late 20th century, it was increasingly clear that Kingston Pen represented an outdated approach. Its daily operations reflected a philosophy centered on control rather than transformation. Yet change remained slow, constrained by tradition and infrastructure. Understanding daily life inside Kingston Pen reveals why the institution inspired fear. It was not only the severity of punishment but the persistence of deprivation. The prison functioned as intended, enforcing order through restriction. But the cost, according to documented evidence, was human endurance tested to its limits. This chapter shows how Kingston Pen operated on an everyday level, shaping behavior through structure and discipline. To fully understand its legacy, the final chapter will examine how scrutiny, reform efforts, and closure reshaped its place in Canadian history. Scrutiny, closure, and the legacy of Kingston Penitentiary. By the late 20th century, Kingston Penitentiary stood as a symbol of an earlier era of punishment in Canada. Its limestone walls, once seen as markers of order and authority, increasingly came to represent rigidity, suffering, and resistance to reform. According to government records and public inquiries, the forces that ultimately led to its closure were not sudden but cumulative, shaped by decades of criticism, evolving legal standards, and changing public expectations about justice. Scrutiny of Kingston Pen intensified as Canada's correctional philosophy shifted. Beginning in the 1960s and accelerating through the 1970s, policymakers began emphasizing rehabilitation and reintegration over purely punitive confinement. Reports commissioned by the federal government questioned whether institutions like Kingston Pen were compatible with these goals. According to documented findings, the prison's design and culture made meaningful reform difficult to implement. One of the most influential developments was the rise of prisoners' rights discourse. Legal scholars and advocacy groups increasingly argued that incarceration did not negate basic human rights. Court cases challenged conditions of confinement, disciplinary practices, and access to due process. While Kingston Pen was not always the direct subject of litigation, the principles established by these cases applied broadly across the federal system. Public inquiries played a critical role. According to archived reports, commissions examining federal corrections repeatedly cited Kingston Pen as an example of outdated infrastructure. Inspectors documented poor ventilation, overcrowding, and limited access to programming. These findings were often accompanied by recommendations for modernization or replacement, though implementation lagged. The issue of segregation drew particular attention. By the late 20th century, prolonged solitary confinement was increasingly viewed as harmful. Oversight bodies raised concerns about psychological effects and lack of oversight. According to documented reviews, Kingston Pen relied heavily on segregation to manage behavior, reinforcing perceptions of severity and inflexibility. Media coverage amplified these concerns. Investigative journalists gained access to government documents through access to information laws, publishing detailed accounts of life inside Kingston Pen. These reports often included testimony from former inmates and staff, highlighting conditions that contrasted sharply with Canada's international reputation for humane corrections. While coverage varied in tone, it contributed to growing public awareness. Staff perspectives added complexity to the debate. Correctional officers acknowledged challenges associated with the aging facility. According to union statements and internal assessments, cramped spaces, poor sight lines, and outdated security systems increased risk. Many officers expressed pride in their professionalism while recognizing that the environment itself created constant tension. Financial considerations became increasingly significant. Maintaining Kingston Pen was expensive. According to Correctional Service Canada analyses, the cost of repairs and upgrades continued to rise. Retrofitting the prison to meet modern standards for safety, accessibility, and programming would require substantial investment, prompting questions about cost-effectiveness. At the same time, newer federal institutions were being built elsewhere, incorporating modern design principles. These facilities emphasized dynamic security, improved visibility, and expanded program space. According to policy documents, the contrast highlighted Kingston Pen's limitations. It was increasingly viewed as a poor fit for contemporary correctional objectives. Inmates continued to experience the effects of these structural shortcomings. Despite incremental reforms, daily life remained restrictive. According to testimony cited in oversight reports, access to education, vocational training, and mental health services was inconsistent. For prisoners serving long sentences, prospects for progression felt distant. The role of mental health gained prominence in policy discussions. Federal reviews acknowledged that a significant portion of the incarcerated population experienced mental health challenges. Kingston Pen's environment, characterized by isolation and rigidity, was seen as ill-suited to therapeutic intervention. According to experts, this mismatch exacerbated distress rather than alleviating it. Indigenous incarceration emerged as another critical issue. By the late 20th century, data clearly showed that indigenous people were overrepresented in federal prisons. Kingston Pen was no exception. According to government analyses, systemic factors such as colonial history and socioeconomic disadvantage contributed to this disparity. Efforts to introduce culturally appropriate programming were limited by the institution's structure. Victims' perspectives were also part of the conversation. For many victims of serious crime, Kingston Pen symbolized accountability and public safety. Public consultations revealed diverse views, with some emphasizing the importance of punishment and others supporting rehabilitation. Policymakers were tasked with balancing these perspectives within constitutional and ethical boundaries. The decision to close Kingston Pen was announced in the early 2010s. According to official statements, the closure reflected a combination of factors: aging infrastructure, high maintenance costs, and alignment with modern correctional strategy. The announcement was met with mixed reactions, including concern about job losses and questions about inmate transfers. In 2013, Kingston Penitentiary officially closed after nearly 180 years of operation. The process of decommissioning involved transferring inmates to other federal institutions. According to Correctional Service Canada, these transfers were planned to minimize disruption, though adjustment was inevitable for those moved. Closure marked the end of Kingston Pen's role as an active prison, but not the end of its significance. The site was preserved as a historic landmark. Guided tours and educational programs were introduced, allowing the public to see inside the institution. According to heritage organizations, this approach aimed to foster understanding rather than glorification. Public access transformed Kingston Pen's narrative. Visitors walked through cell ranges, segregation units, and exercise yards, encountering spaces once hidden from view. Interpretive materials emphasized historical context, acknowledging both the prison's role in Canada's justice system and the hardships endured within its walls. Former inmates responded to this transformation with mixed emotions. Some viewed public tours as opportunities for education, while others expressed discomfort with their suffering becoming a point of interest. According to interviews, reactions varied depending on individual experiences and perspectives on accountability. Academic interest in Kingston Pen increased after its closure. Researchers examined archival records, using the institution as a case study in penal evolution. According to scholarly analyses, Kingston Pen illustrated how correctional philosophies shape architecture, culture, and outcomes. It became a reference point in discussions about reform. The prison's legacy also influenced contemporary policy debates. As Canada continues to grapple with issues such as solitary confinement, mental health, and Indigenous overrepresentation, Kingston Pen serves as a cautionary example. Policymakers cite its history when arguing for alternatives to purely punitive models. Internationally, Kingston Pen is often mentioned in comparative studies of prison systems. According to criminologists, its longevity highlights how institutions can persist long after their underlying philosophies are questioned. The prison's closure is seen as part of a broader global reevaluation of incarceration practices. Despite closure, the fear associated with Kingston Pen endures in cultural memory. Stories passed down among incarcerated populations and within communities reinforce its reputation. According to sociological research, institutional myths often persist because they are grounded in lived experience, even as circumstances change. Understanding why no one wanted to be sent to Kingston Pen requires recognizing the cumulative weight of its practices. Fear was not solely about violence or punishment in isolation. It was about the totality of conditions: isolation, monotony, and the sense of being trapped in an unforgiving system. The closure of Kingston Pen does not erase its impact. Many individuals who passed through its gates carried lasting effects into their lives after release. According to studies on incarceration, prolonged exposure to restrictive environments can shape behavior and outlook long after confinement ends. For correctional staff, Kingston Pen was also formative. Officers who worked there often described the experience as challenging and defining. According to workplace studies, exposure to high-stress environments influences attitudes toward authority, safety, and reform. Kingston Pen's story underscores the importance of oversight and accountability. Without sustained scrutiny, institutions can drift toward practices that prioritize control over humanity. The prison's history illustrates how difficult it is to reverse such trajectories once established. As Canada continues to reform its justice system, Kingston Pen remains a reference point. Its stone walls stand as reminders of past assumptions about punishment. According to documented analysis, learning from this history is essential to avoid repeating it. This documentary concludes with a recognition that Kingston Penitentiary was not an anomaly but a product of its time. Its severity reflected beliefs widely held when it was built. Its decline reflects changing values and legal standards. Understanding both is necessary to grasp its full meaning. Why no one wanted to be sent to Kingston Pen was never a mystery to those who lived or worked there. It was embedded in daily life, institutional design, and cultural reputation. Today, as its gates remain closed, Kingston Pen continues to inform how Canadians think about justice, punishment, and the possibility of change.